Well, kia ora and good morning. This is VTV Live, sixth session. And this morning we have Chris Roberts with us. I'll get to the introduction in a second. Like always, don't be afraid to drop your comments, questions in the chat function. Try and get to as many as we can. But Chris, welcome aboard.
Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. So it brings a different perspective, obviously having TIA, but I won't introduce you. You introduce us. You introduce yourself. Give us a little bit of background on who you are. I'd take it most probably know you.
Sure. Look, Chris Roberts, based here in Wellington. Been with tourism industry Aotearoa for 7 years, a bit over 7 years. Prior to that, I was at Tourism New Zealand for a few years, various corporate roles before that, and going back quite a while, in fact, back to last century, worked at Parliament in various roles, including working with the Minister of Tourism there. So a long involvement with tourism, with a bit of time spent in other industries. I actually started life as a journalist, a radio journalist. That was my first career. And somehow ended up in tourism and have loved every minute of it, despite the fact of how hard the last 18 months has been. For anyone who doesn't know, Tourism Industry Aotearoa, we're the industry association. I guess we're sort of like the Federated Farmers of Tourism. We're the one tourism body that is here for every part of tourism, for all aspects of the industry. And we like to think we're here for not just our members, but for the whole industry. We rely on our membership fees, on events that we run and some corporate partners, etc. We're not government funded. We're not part of government. That's our friends at Tourism New Zealand, who are a very different agency, but we work very closely with them. And obviously in the last 18 months in particular, we've been doing what we can to support tourism businesses across the country in this most incredibly difficult time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. So a long history in tourism. The last 18 months would have probably been your biggest challenge to date, I imagine.
Yeah, look, it's been a real change, hasn't it? Tourism was on a real growth path from about 2013, 2014. And we were exceeding all targets, and we were a huge success. In fact, we were the victims of our own success in New Zealand, and that's where those conversations started coming about over tourism and congestion, and was tourism growing too quickly? All those problems disappeared pretty suddenly in early 2020. We fell off a cliff. The borders got closed. No longer a problem about having too many tourists. We didn't have any. Yeah, and that's certainly the biggest crisis our industry has ever faced. The biggest crisis the global tourism industry has ever faced. And probably important to remember, this is not a New Zealand event, of course. And I do feel sorry for some of the tourism businesses and situations around the world who have actually had it far harder than we've had it. So we've also got to be thankful that we've had opportunities with domestic tourism over the last 18 months at various times to still operate, and that's a reason why most of our tourism businesses is still hanging in there grimly. We haven't seen total decimation. It's been incredibly hard for all those tourism businesses out there, but most of them are still around at this point.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's very good overview, and it sets the scene well. What, from your perspective, like we've had a lot of different perspectives on VTV. From your perspective, what's your take on where we find ourselves as a sector currently?
Well, you just have to look at the numbers. We don't have international visitors, and that was over 40% of the income for tourism. But we for some time and for quite a while, we still had access to the 58% of the spend that comes from domestic. And New Zealanders did us proud. New Zealanders were out there spending. They couldn't travel overseas other than the Cook Islands for a while and briefly to Australia. So they were spending well. We had a big adjustment, and businesses were finding ways to get through. Now, obviously, there's no tourism happening in Auckland. So incredibly difficult for the tourism and hospitality businesses there. And for the rest of New Zealand, there's some degree of tourism happening. School holidays is always a boost, but not the normal level of boost because that Auckland market is unavailable. Yep. So no international visitors, no Aucklanders. Together, that's 2/3 of tourism. So we're left fighting over 1/3. And for any business that's now only got 1/3 of its normal customers available, that's a pretty dire situation.
Yeah, that's never going to look too rosy for, as you say, any market, regardless of where you are. If you cut out 2/3 of it, that's a rough gig. You did right. What is the current situation we're in? In your mind, how is this different from the first one? And then I suppose we'll lead on to, and what does that difference make? But if we touch on the first part, how is it different? How is it different from our first? When I say our first one, when we're talking with Aucklanders in the room, I'm meaning nationwide.
Look, I think we all know this. That sort of the feeling this time round is quite different. No one knew what was going on back in March last year. I know for ourselves, suddenly we were all working from home and we were incredibly busy, and there was a new challenge, not every day, but literally every hour, to work out what was going on. We were, dealing with this as it came along to us, and everyone was scrambling madly to find their way through that. This time we're better prepared. We knew what level 4 was going to involve. We knew what level 3 was going to involve. But we're a little bit tired. We're a bit over all of this. So despite being more prepared for it, we're just not as comfortable with the situation we find ourselves in. We know mental health concerns are a huge issue, and we've been looking at that to a large degree about how our employers and employees are holding up under all of this strain. But it's just wearing. And people have had enough. So they're sort of gritting their teeth, expressing their frustrations in various avenues, and just waiting to get through this.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. We have touched on this and on this forum before, but we did a survey of our client base. And we got, I think it was off the top of my head, around, I think it was 400 recipients came back, filled out a survey about 6-8 weeks ago. And those main words were frustrated and anxious, those type words. So as you say, a lot of that hope isn't quite, not quite the same as previously.
We saw a huge mood change when we were very pleased to be able to run Trends, the big tourism trade show.
Yes, right.
Otatahi, Christchurch in May. And to get that away and to have that event, at that point, the Australian bubble had just opened, and we didn't have really any Australians here yet, but we were optimistic that they were going to be coming over. And we did one of those word clouds at Trends, which 700 people attended. And the dominant words were optimistic, confident. They were all positive terms that came through. And it was incredible, the vibe at Trends about how positive people were feeling about the prospects, and that, hey, we're going to survive this and come out. If we were having that same word cloud right now, I think it would have a very different look to it.
Yeah, that's good. So what's that difference mean for us? So the first time it was sort of we had that high level of hope. This time, not so much, So that difference from your perspective, what does that mean for us?
Look, I think it's a realistic response to the situation we find ourselves in, and in a way we don't want to be carried away with optimism. I think as human beings we're naturally optimistic, and we think, oh, that's it's going to come right, and of course. In this situation, it is going to come right. We just don't know when. New Zealand's tourism product is as fantastic as it ever has been. Our tourism operators are as capable as they've ever been. We don't know when the customers are going to be back. And so that's the hard choice. and we're hearing, incredibly hard stories. I had an email yesterday telling me about some of our members who are now surviving on food parcels. Right. And so when you hear that sort of story, it really gets down to the only advice I could give at that point was you need to go and find another source of income. Mm-hmm. You can't try to keep your tourism activity going if you're now receiving food parcels to get through the week. I want your tourism business to be back, but you're going to have to find something to do for the next 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, whatever it's going to be. Please come back to tourism when the time's right, but don't destroy yourself and your livelihood trying to hang in there when it just doesn't make sense to do so.
Doesn't make sense, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, it's been a lot of people doing it tough. And, some of us in the accommodation sector, we have different avenues. Some of the, tourism and accommodation quite closely linked, but then slightly different in their own rights as well. I was also thinking, Chris, a question to put forward to you is the elimination strategy seems to have gone by the way. I'm not going to get into politics, but that sort of seems to have faded in the last couple of weeks. What does that mean for us? If we're looking forward into the future, what does that mean?
Yeah, I guess we're leaving behind elimination. We're in a transition to being a fully vaccinated country, and then basically allowing COVID to be endemic in New Zealand like it is in other parts of the world, and just managing it in the long term. So we're in this difficult transition period, and I think there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. We need to transition. Ideally, we would all be the vaccination rollout would have been completed by now, but we're going to have this awkward period for a month or two. For tourism, we need to get the primary objective right at the moment remains getting vaccinated, because nothing else is going to happen until we're as vaccinated as highly as possible. Mm. We are then going to start seeing borders open. I'm confident about that. That's most likely going to be next year. We're seeing some interesting moves elsewhere. Australia is still saying it's going to start opening its borders in November. Qantas has got flights on sale between Australia and the US and other markets from December. So they're looking to kick off. So what happens elsewhere will perhaps influence what happens here. Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. But I suspect we're likely to have a Kiwi-only summer through December, January, and those borders might start opening in February. Now, I've got no inside word on that. It's just my gut feel of how things might go. And then I do know there's a lot of work happening on what that border opening will look like, what our, getting that international vaccination passport in place so that we can rely on the fact that anyone coming in is vaccinated, what sort of testing regime, what sort of hygiene regime, getting all that sorted now so that when we do open up, we know how we're going to do it. And so I think we'll see a gradual reintroduction of people back into New Zealand from overseas. I'm hoping by February, but I don't have a crystal ball more than anyone else does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. So from the 18 months staring us in the face, so the 18 months in front of us, what can we learn from other countries? I mean, we're probably not the first off the blocks as far as taking this step from elimination to living with, I suppose. So when you look at the global market, what are you seeing from other countries that have gone through this phase?
I think we have to be ready for taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back, because that's what we're seeing. Countries are trying things overseas, and that does help. We can learn from what's been attempted overseas, but almost every case, they've probably overreached and then had to pull back again. So they've opened up, and then COVID's flared up, and they've had to reimpose restrictions. So you can look at literally a couple of weeks ago, Singapore's been lauded as the place doing it the best, and they're now reimposing restrictions and probably back at about a level 3 in the New Zealand terms, temporarily because they've had a flare up. So
what's their vaccination rate? Do you know off the top of your head?
They're up about 80% double vaccinated. So they're in the top half a dozen countries in the world. Right. So that's a lesson. Even at that high vaccination rate, you can get a flare up. So there's going to be a lot to learn from overseas, but I think we're not going to have a magic Declaration Day or Freedom Day, as I think Boris Johnson called it in the UK, where we can say, hooray, it's all over, we're opening up, we're reconnected. It'll be step by step, and occasionally I think there'll be a step backwards again. We'll try something and it might not work. And that's hard on tourism operators. For example, at some point we'll open up to the USA. But if something goes wrong with opening up to that market, then that might get cut off again. It's just a reality. So how does a tourism business manage that with bookings and everything else? I think we're going to have to keep dealing with what's in front of us. Plan for the worst. What's the worst that could happen? And that perhaps there's no customers at all. But be ready to react to the opportunities that come along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting that it's I suppose for the listeners on the call, I mean the theme that I'm picking up is that uncertainty is going to live with us. So we've got to be prepared to live with that, I suppose, and that way we've got to be ready to be able to adjust at a moment's notice. And that is, I mean, as you've alluded to, it's very taxing even from a mental perspective. But that's sort of the environment we find ourselves in, isn't it?
Yeah, and different governments have got different approaches around the world, and I know there's quite a lot of sentiment amongst our industry that the government needs to give us more details, more planning and dates. Tell us when things are going to happen. Mm-hmm. I can understand both arguments because Australia has gone down that route. They've put all sorts of dates out there, at state level and federal level. So, when we hit this percentage of vaccination, we're going to take this action, and when we hit this, we're going to take that action. Yeah. The problem with that approach is you may end up having to change your mind and may end up moving those dates. And so, is that any more certain to the approach that's been taken here? Is not giving those dates and not being as certain. So, I'm not sure which approach is going to prove the best. They are different approaches, but I think the reality is no one's got any certainty at the moment. And I don't want to be a doomsday merchant, but what happens if something worse than Delta comes along, and we're dealing with a whole new situation? There's still so many unknowns in this whole situation.
Yeah. And I suppose the one, I mean, the positive that we can take out of it is keeping an eye on those global markets. You've spoken about a few different countries, the way that they've fluctuated in that. So we probably, as you said, we're probably naturally optimistic, and especially in this market, we find it very optimistic, just as people. But if we watch those other countries that are in a similar phase or slightly ahead of us, we can see those 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So then it doesn't come as a shock to us, I suppose. We're planning from that.
Yeah, and also every indication we're getting is that there is still a demand for travel. Mm-hmm. There will be a portion of of the global population that is too nervous to travel now or will stay close to home. Yeah. But every indication we get from what we're seeing where markets are opening up, that people are piling onto the planes and heading off on holiday. I know our good friends at Tourism New Zealand who survey constantly into those international markets. The demand to come to New Zealand is still very high. So there's no dropping away in the popularity of New Zealand. The issue we may have is not the demand to come here, it's the ability to get here. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we don't have a lot of planes flying to New Zealand at the moment, and the ones that are flying are getting massively subsidised to fly freight in and out of the country. I
Yeah.
think the bill for that is getting well past $500 million that the government is subsidising airlines to keep those flights open for freight and for returning New Zealanders who are coming through MIQ. As other markets open up, airlines naturally are putting their airlines where the profits are.
Yeah.
And if we stay closed off longer than other countries, then all of those planes are going to be allocated elsewhere. And if we're near the end of the queue, and when we say, right, we now want everyone to start flying here from the US, there may not be any planes left. We'll always have Air New Zealand, and that's good. Air New Zealand brings about 35-40% of the passengers in and out of the country. But those other airlines, they have no loyalty to New Zealand necessarily. And I know this is exercising the minds of our airports in particular, very much of how they're working those relationships extremely hard to make sure that we can hang on to as many of those overseas airlines as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's good. And then I suppose probably from more particularly to the TIA, what are you doing at the moment to help with your members and that type of thing?
Yeah, look, we're doing more since COVID started in terms of direct services engagement with members than certainly we've done in my time and maybe ever. So we know that members just need that personal engagement. So our team is, on the phone very regularly with members. We're running a coffee catch up every Friday when any member can just dial in and download their problems and share their problems over in an informal setting, and that people are finding that really just getting things off their chest. We're looking at mental health support services. We're running a lot of webinars, just providing information for members. And so the team here is just here to, you just need to download to someone. We don't necessarily have all the answers for you, but we're certainly here to listen. Yeah. And then at the same time, we're trying to stay across those big strategic issues. So we're still working where we can on what's either called the reimagining of tourism or the reinvention or the reestablishment of tourism, any of those words. What's tourism going to look like in the future? And we've got to play a role in that as well. What do we think tourism is going to be like in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 20 years' time? And we've got to keep our eye on that discussion and make sure that the journey ahead is heading in the right direction. So we're trying to do both that, the tactical, sort of almost pastoral care with members, as well as focusing on the big strategic issues.
Yeah, both equally as important. And I mean, the last thing you want to do is the lights to come on and you don't know yet. There's no plan ahead, which is that sort of that fear always, isn't there, of not knowing where you're going.
And look, to be fair on that, I'm concerned that there is no plan ahead yet. There's lots of good intentions. There's lots of talk about planning to have a plan, but we actually need to get on with it with some urgency because we don't have that plan yet.
Yeah, that leads me into my next question: is what advice would you give to accommodation owners, particularly that they should be taking advantage of currently, and sort of preparing for? Probably the first part is, what should they be taking advantage of right here and now? Anything comes to mind there?
Well, if you're outside of Auckland, any domestic visitor that wants to stay with you, work those relationships that you have with the corporate sector. I know the corporate sector has been very slow to recover this time round compared to last year, so we haven't seen a lot of corporate travel. That may just reflect the influence of Auckland, and a lot of other corporate travel is not happening because the Aucklanders can't join it. But look to those corporate travellers and when they'll be back. It's going to be, timing wise, it's very hard to see a lot of activity October, November, in terms of leisure travel. Kiwis are probably now going to hold off to summer to do that travel. So it's going to be a bit quiet, much quieter than we would like over the next couple of months. Staffing, I mean, prior to this lockdown, the issue that had risen to number one, and I know it was there big time with the accommodation, was workforce. Actually, we're getting back, occupancy numbers are up, can't find staff. Now, if you're currently empty or without a lot of customers, that problem might have eased a bit, but it's going to come back, and hopefully it's very soon. Hopefully this summer is a busy time for all of us, even if it's just a domestic summer, and you're going to need staff, and suddenly you're going to have staffing problems again. So if you've got loyal staff, hang on to them. Use that wage subsidy, keep those staff on. Think now about, right, I'm getting by now on 10 staff, but if I'm back at reasonable occupancy levels this summer and we're going to need 50, where the hell am I going to get them from? I need to start planning now and get those plans in place. Because we risk from yo-yoing from I've got no work for anyone to I've got no workers for the work that I now need to do. And we don't want to be bouncing back and forth between those two.
It's a real balancing act, isn't it? And it's a very real struggle at the same time, but for those on the call, we also, as most would know, we also work a bit in the healthcare, aged care sector, providing a lot of our bedding and that kind of thing into that section. And their biggest thing at the moment is staff as well. So that industry is, I suppose, well, it's a pretty stable industry. So there could be a little bit of luring of staff from because it's a lot of those jobs are semi interchangeable. So they're buying for staff too at the moment. So just bear that in mind for anyone out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you add up what all the different industries are saying in terms of their staff shortages, we're probably short of about 1 million people in New Zealand. We just don't have the people for all these jobs that are apparently out there. And we do know that, we think about at least 40,000, but even up to 90,000 tourism workers lost their jobs in 2020. And they're clearly not on the unemployment list. They've got transferable skills. They've all been taken up and found jobs elsewhere because they're good people. But so they're not sitting around waiting for us to call them up and have them back. So it's going to be a real fight. One good piece of news was the announcement from the government on immigration and residency, and suddenly making it far easier to get residency in New Zealand. And that's a huge win. We think there's 25,000 migrant workers across tourism and hospitality in New Zealand who now have a pathway to residency. So if you've got some of those workers or one of those workers, I'm sure you've already talked to them about how they may now become a Kiwi. They've got a chance to stay here permanently, and that's a fantastic thing. And so that's one. I think that was the brightest bit of news in the last few weeks. I think it's a fantastic opportunity for those great people to stay here and keep contributing.
That's good. Yeah, Chair went up around our office with a few of our staff when that news came through, so it meant a lot to them. Chris, I got a question here from Jackie Chill. Are TIA working with members and supporting discussions around the possible mandatory vaccination for both employees and or guests?
Absolutely, and literally 1 minute before joining you for this, I was working on a submission into the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, who are working on the vaccination certificates at the moment. So we're feeding into that work, and that work's progressing quite quickly. And I think we want those vaccination certificates available as soon as possible. So that's one part of the answer. That will enable venues and events to determine that everyone must be vaccinated. Who's coming to their event or venue, or who's working at their event or venue. It won't necessarily help every business in terms of being able to make it mandatory. And there's still some tricky employment legislation to go through. I don't think the issue is going to be as difficult with your customers. If you put in your terms and conditions that At our accommodation business, we only want fully vaccinated customers, and that's a condition of you booking with us. You'll be able to do that.
Yeah.
Insisting that all your staff are vaccinated, that's still tricky, and there's a process. There's plenty of advice on the different websites. You've got to run a health and safety risk assessment of each position. You may well find that some back office, the sales and marketing person in the back office, you won't be able to justify that they have to be vaccinated if they don't have any customer contact. So you've got to go through that process and work through it. You can ask staff if they're vaccinated. They don't have to tell you. Look at the advice that's available. TIA members have access to some legal advice that's in our members only area that we've got from Lane Neve. It's very good advice, but you may well need to go get your own legal advice, especially dealing how you deal with your staff.
Yeah, that's good. The last thing you'd want at this point in time would be an employment dispute on your hands, because that's very costly as well, as we know.
Well, we've been told that in the end this will be settled in the courts, but no one wants to be that test case. Everyone's keen for someone else to be the test case.
Yeah. I've got a question come through from Les Morgan from the Sedema Group. Chris, the tourism industry has been seen by many as a group of whingers. How do we overcome this sentiment as we continue to advocate for more government assistance?
Yeah, Les, we're very well, as you know, we're very well aware of that, and we've attempted, I know TIA has attempted not to be a whinger and to be solutions focused. Obviously we will call out decisions that we think are wrong, but we want to, if we do that, we want to suggest other alternatives. But there are a lot of quite understandably upset tourism people out there, and I do know that the government, some parts of government are of the view that that tourism just bitches and moans too much. I think that you can't expect whose livelihoods and businesses are crashing down around them to stay silent. People are entitled to express their views, and government needs to be a little bit more thick-skinned about criticism. But for official representatives like ourselves, we'll try to be as constructive as possible. Most people don't see the work we're doing. Most of the work we're doing is behind the scenes directly. I do a reasonable amount of media, but that's not the main communication channel that we use to try and convince government to act in certain ways. We're talking at official level, at minister levels, and trying to have influence that way.
No, that's good. That's good. It's very. I mean, we talk with customers in this section all day, every day, and there's some of the stories that you hear. They've got every right to be, whinging. I mean, not that they're whinging, but you know what I mean, to be expressing their feelings and that, because it's very real struggle.
And look, one decision we made last year was as TIA, we are not health experts, so we don't question any of the government's health-based decisions. So if they believe Auckland needs to be at level 3, that's their decision based on health advice. I have no knowledge to argue against that. What we will point out is the impact of that decision on tourism and related industries, and how we want to be supported to deal with that impact. So, we leave the health decisions to the health experts, and we stick with pointing out the impacts on tourism.
It's amazing how many health experts come out of the woodwork when,
Yeah,
probably
absolutely.
not so many haven't been to university or anything, but there's a lot of free advice, you might say.
Yeah, and on that, I mean, the only health advice we give is get vaccinated.
Yeah.
Get yourself vaccinated, get your friends vaccinated, get your workers vaccinated, get everyone you know vaccinated, because a lot of tourism people are feeling quite dispowered at the moment. They can't influence what's going on. The one influence you can have is getting people vaccinated.
Yeah, that's good. I got my second one yesterday, so today's slightly drowsy, but you know, we're getting there. Now, Chris, we're coming up 35 minutes here. Just mindful of everybody's time as always. But really appreciate your time, your advice, and the work that you're doing behind the scenes. As you say, we're not always aware of it, but really appreciate the time you've taken out of your busy schedule. Any last words, Chris, to the group here?
Look, I constantly say that tourism, the wider tourism industry is full of resilient, passionate people. And that's, I mean, I absolutely believe that. I love this industry and I get to meet our tourism people when we can get together at things like Trends. And they are bloody amazing people and they are passionate. And people are in tourism and the related industries because they love it, not because it's the best place to make money. And we're all, and the majority are hanging in there. It's amazing how few have disappeared. As I said earlier, perhaps some do need to disappear for a little while because you don't want to destroy yourselves trying to hang in. But we'll get through this. We'll be in a bizarre way better for it, better for every crisis you can learn something from. And I don't know when, but we'll be back stronger than ever, and we'll eventually put all this behind us. But hang in there, everyone.
No, I heartily agree. It's a very good industry to be a part of. So keep up the good work, everybody, and including yourself, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
No worries at all. It's our pleasure. Keep up the great work.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody.
I'll pass that on to our team because the team appreciates knowing that everything they're doing, well, not everything they do will be appreciated by everyone, but the general sentiment is that we're doing our very best.
Yeah, no, you can pass that on with heartfelt thanks from us all. Appreciate it. Thanks, Chris, and thank you, everybody. See you here next Thursday, 11 a.m. Cheers.